Okay, welcome back everyone. Thank you for coming back in after the brief respite in the sunshine. I'm sure that was a little difficult to drag yourself back in here, but it's going to be worth it. And if you're watching us online, thank you again for also joining in. I'm just here to do a very quick introduction of our next panel on gender integration for climate action. And our moderator that I will pass the baton to is Miel Neopold, the president of the Mara Partners. So please welcome Miel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lana, and welcome everyone. So I'm going to start by saying what you're about to hear is not a fire drill. This is perk your ears up, because we're going to learn a lot of really transformative things from this esteemed panel. So I don't need to tell this audience that this, obviously, we're running out of time to address climate change. However, this is going to be a very hopeful panel. And we're going to learn a lot about these approaches and how women's leadership makes a really big difference. So if you were to Google women and climate change, you'll inevitably find that women are the victims of this and the victims of that. And I tend to disregard and overlook as much as possible those stories, and I'm sure a lot of you do the same. And I go straight to well, what about the positive? What about the difference that it makes? So we're going to be hearing a lot about that. And you know, basically, because we're here with CIF and GDI, we know that the climate investment funds are committed to helping advance gender equality outcomes through its innovative investments in climate solutions that are implemented at scale. But this session, we're going to learn from these panelists, who I'll introduce in just a minute, about designing and implementing climate development operations with an eye towards creating transformative outcomes that put women at the heart of the process as climate change agents, which is a real mouthful. And then also, finally, in light of this particular urgency that I mentioned earlier, we really have a responsibility, but we also have a huge opportunity to focus on women now, and our panelists will kick us off on this learning journey. So with that, I would say to my immediate left, we have Marielena Vizaki, who is Principal Gender Advisor at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. To her left, we have Gertrude Kenyangi with the Support for Women in Agriculture and Environment, known as SWAGEN or SWAGEN.
Yes.
You'll get to that.
Right, yeah.
Yes, good, from Uganda. And then Jennifer Solitaroff, Senior Social Development Specialist, Gender Group at the World Bank. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. Yes. So, Marielena, I'm going to begin with you. So one of the challenging areas in climate resilience activities has been attracting private sector investment in adaptation. However, EBRD has developed a large and growing business line in private sector finance for resilience, most notably under your ClimAdapt program that began in Tajikistan. Can you tell us more about this program, the partners on the ground, and what your recent E&L study found about the way that EBRD is reaching women borrowers in an enhanced way with finance for climate technologies for adaptation?
Absolutely.
Let's take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. ClimAdapt is a project that started in 2014, and implementation basically was between 2016 and 2018. It stands for Tajik Climate Resilience Financing Facility, and the objective was to provide much-needed financing for the uptake of green technologies to promote efficient use of water, energy, and land resources in Tajikistan. The EBRD mainly works with the private sector, so we partnered with local financial institutions, 3 of which were microfinance institutions and 2 local banks. And we structured a comprehensive gender component to make sure that both men and women have access to financing to build resilience to climate shocks. Women are also working in the agriculture sector in Tajikistan, which is highly vulnerable. And we know that Tajikistan mainly relies on snowmelt, on rainfall for energy and water use. So we structured the gender component by which we provided training to loan officers to understand the needs and priorities of women sub-borrowers, to better promote solutions, technology solutions, ranging from drip irrigation to water drainage technologies, and also partner with a local women business association to promote knowledge and access to information, because we often find that women do not have access to information about the opportunities to build climate resilience. We had very, very good results. We were very impressed. 30% of the portfolio were women sub-borrowers. This reflected 20% of the volume of loans. And if we compare this to the background in Tajikistan, where 9% of women have a bank account, this was very impressive. We also used these learnings to learn ourselves how to structure the new investments EBRD makes across a number of countries that will be co-financed by the Green Climate Fund. We definitely will be working in this area going forward, and we know that building climate resilience is an important priority for us. So the evaluation and learning activity was hugely helpful. We collaborated very closely with the CIF administrative unit. We also worked internally across departments, so gender and economic inclusion together with the energy efficiency, climate change department together with the donor co-financing, as well as the banking teams and investment officers on the ground to really deliver this. So it was a collaborative effort.
Wow, yeah. So if we drill down just a little teeny bit, it sounds like you've had sort of, what would you describe as sort of the secret success or the secret sauce that made your ability to reach women really succeed? Because you made that distinction between, you know, how banking occurs with women in Tajikistan and how you had far better outcomes. Do you know how would you put a quick answer on what the secret was?
I think definitely providing access to information and reaching out to women and men, both in urban and rural areas, and also working very closely with the loan officers who have these very strong relationships with their customers is very helpful. And the fact that we worked with microfinance institutions who know their customer base very well, women customers, was instrumental.
I see, that's interesting. So then I'll give you one more question before we move on to Gertrude. So EBRD has had particular success in commissioning practice evaluations with a view to learning what works well in gender and climate finance operations. One study series on district heating, which we spoke about at the break, at the municipal level in Turkey, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, supported by CIF, was especially important in generating evidence on good practice in working with women consumers and ways to strengthen quality of operational delivery, notably on heating. Can you tell us some of the key conclusions from that study?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
So we undertook 4 project-level gender assessments in 4 cities: Aktau, Semey, Kizilorda in Kazakhstan, and the city of Latsk in Ukraine, between 2014 and 2016. And we were interested to identify what are the roles and responsibilities of women energy users, consumers, but also try to identify how to promote access to economic opportunities, in that case employment, in male-dominated sectors. So we look at both sides. And we had very interesting findings. On the service provision side, we basically found that women prefer district heating as an energy source compared to coal and firewood because it's labor intensive, or gas because of safety concerns. We also found that for meter readings and bill payment collection, women would be more reluctant to open the door to men staff of companies because of safety concerns again, and would welcome more women to perform those functions. And then in terms of customer feedback, because women tend to spend more time at home, they were the ones who would actually make a phone call and submit a complaint. So they would much prefer and interact better if there was a woman on the other side of the line. Mm-hmm. So these findings were taken on board by the service providers in those cities, and they were able to adjust their service provision, having in mind what consumers, men and women, opted for. And then on the employment side, for example, in CEMEI, there was mainly a male-dominated technical roles division. So what they tried to do was to offer internships to young graduates, and 4 out of 7 on that year were for women, young graduates. In the city of Latsk, we had another interesting example. During the heating period between October and April, there is a requirement for unskilled workers to work in the boiler room. So basically, they hired women, 80% of women, who spend their time working as seasonal agricultural workers during the summer. So this meant that they had enhanced access to economic opportunities and employment.
Right. And can you say a little bit, that's sort of on the outside, but then can you say about what this meant within EBRD and you know, what changes, these lessons learned, did it change anything with, for example, your municipal finance team, or what were some of the things that happened internally as well?
This was very helpful for us to distill the lessons and to craft a toolkit, a set of questions. So when we work with our municipal clients and service providers, especially as part of their corporate development programs and capacity enhancement, we use this information to help them structure service provision in a gender-sensitive way. So this was taken up by banking teams, and it's part of our delivery at the EBRD.
And do you feel like it's really taking root within your own teams?
Absolutely.
Yeah, fantastic. So Gertrude, turning it over to you now. I feel like you're everywhere. I saw you in Morocco. I heard you were yesterday over here at the Trust Fund. I know that you're also an observer to the forest investment program of the CIF. And you're coming from Swagan, you'll say it better than I will, which is a civil society organization in Uganda. What are the main gender issues related to forests and climate change that your members are facing? And in what ways have you observed FIP supporting women in particular in the forest sector in your region?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, I'm from Support for Women in Agriculture and Environment. That's the full version of Swagan. Yeah, we face a multitude of gender issues in forests. For instance, just to mention a few, access to forest resources, control of forest resources, ownership, gender differences in ownership of forest resources. Women have limited access, not completely no access, but they have limited access, limited regulated access, and no control whatsoever. Many women, very many women, do not own forest resources. They do not take part in decision making, while men take part in decision making, and there is no meaningful participation in forest governance. In addition, forest tenure rights are not clearly defined. They are not clearly defined for both men and women. But even if they were, women's insecure land tenure system is more a norm rather than an exception. This is because, in spite of most countries, including Uganda, having it enshrined in their constitution, gender equality enshrined in their constitution, there is also a parallel legal system of patriarchal system that is a tradition, and it competes with the with the official legal system. And it's this traditional patriarchal system through which society norms, values, beliefs, rules, and practices, resources are allocated, tasks are assigned, value is given, and power is mobilized. And the patriarchal system tends to favor men. As such, you find that the women are marginalized, and especially at the intersections of other marginalized and vulnerable groups, like the people with disabilities, like the elderly and the youth, like the indigenous peoples. So lastly, I'd like to mention, like I said, there are so many gender issues in forestry. There's limited recognition and appreciation of women's roles and needs as primary users of forests and forest conservation. Forests are still associated with men and timber, while women are associated with the non-timber forest products, which are less profitable. That means their contribution to forest conservation, their rights as forest users and owners are not given as much attention as would be given to men. As far as CFI is concerned, we have, we submitted an investment plan, it was approved, but we were not funded. Uganda was not funded. I shouldn't say we, because I'm here for Africa, not just for Uganda. But Uganda was not funded. But in the forest investment plan, we were required to show how gender issues would be addressed. And that was great support. When eventually we get the funding, I'm sure that women will benefit, because gender was considered very seriously in the investment report.
Right. So in my own work, I do a lot of work in the forests in West Africa, and we've mentioned Tajikistan. I love the diversity on this panel, the geographic. We've got a wide range, and Jennifer's worked in Southeast Asia. And so between us all, I think we've got most of the globe covered. But you mentioned patriarchy, and I know obviously a lot of research shows just how hard that is to shift.
Yes.
Would you say that you're seeing the shift? Do you feel like the shift is happening, and is it somewhat durable in your opinion?
Yeah, there's a bit of shift. I can't say there's no achievement in that regard. There's a bit of shift, but you know the quest for gender equality must be resisted. It has to be resisted because it favors one group over another. The favored group will fight to retain their power, to fight to retain their privilege. It disrupts traditional interpretation of gendered worth. It attempts to change people's most cherished values, so to speak. So as such, it faces a lot of resistance. But yes, there's a shift with more education of women, with more awareness creation, with more information sharing. Women are beginning, not only women, but even some enlightened men are beginning to support the fact that women and men, when women are given the same resources as men, there's higher productivity, there's better forest conservation. So that appreciation is beginning to take root, but it's slow in coming.
Yeah. So actually, before we go to the next question, building on that, I think there's something you've put your finger on to what I would also ask you, sort of the secret sauce question. What do you think are those last few points you made, do you think that that's what's helping bring in this paradigm shift? Is it the fact that things just generally improve for men, women, and children and the planet when women are brought into these roles? But I don't want to put words in your mouth. So what would you say is that secret sauce for how this is shifting?
Well, the secret sauce is a deliberate move to mainstream gender in development. And it's been a result of the fight of very many people, especially women. The fact that we've had things like the Beijing platform, like CEDAW, which I can attribute to women that went before us. And so we have men supporting it. A few men do support it. A few enlightened men do support it. So it's deliberate. It just doesn't happen. It's not an accident. And we must keep the pressure up for gender equality and for gender mainstreaming in development programs.
Great. So thank you for that. So my next question to you is more specifically on this topic of gender transformative outcomes. So CIF, as you know, aims to support gender transformative outcomes in the countries that it supports. What do you think are the key elements that lead to women's empowerment, and how can governments, civil society organizations, and the private sector best support this type of change? And if you could touch on some of the typical pitfalls also.
Okay. Yeah, gender transformative development, I mean, it should happen at different levels. It can't just happen at one level, it won't be effective. So gender as a concept should not be an add-on. At central government level, the central government level should provide a conducive environment. Gender should not be just an add-on, a reform. It should be a transformation. It has got to be mainstreamed in all policies and programs. That calls for institutional rules to be rethought, resources to be redistributed in a gender-responsive way. And there should be sensitivity to change the underlying incentive structure so that benefit sharing from the development process, from forest conservation, accrue to both men and women. And they should be mindful of the intersections. If they accrue to men and women, they should take into consideration other vulnerable groups like people with disabilities, like the elderly, like the youth, and indigenous peoples. Then at project level, I feel that every project should have a component of gender analysis to generate gender disaggregated data to inform planning and decision making. And then at community level, even throughout the structure incidentally, central government, local government, community level, there should be in-house gender training. We must not assume that everyone understands gender. There's a place I've been, a very high level meeting, like you've observed that I'm everywhere. I was at a very high level meeting, and somebody stood up and said, I think any woman here can speak about gender. I mean, any woman can speak about women issues, but not about gender. Gender is a power relation, and it has so many underlying things that should be talked about. So there should be gender training, in-house gender training, at institutional level, at community level, to sensitize people and create awareness of the existence of gender disparities and the need for gender equality, to disseminate knowledge about and address gender issues. So we should build the capacity of both men and women, not just women, to recognize gender disparities. We should impart skills to women. We should bridge the gap. For instance, if we do a gender analysis, we'll be able to establish what gap exists between the capacities of men and capacities of women. Then we'll be able to know what capacity to impart to build for women and for men. And I, for one, would think that gender justice approach, that a gender justice approach would deliver much more than just gender equality. Because gender justice is premised on the notion of social justice, rather than a search for formal equality of opportunity. Gender justice recognizes the unequal constraints and opportunities which underpin gender differences.
Okay.
Is there anything I've left out?
Oh, no, you could clearly. We're going to hear more from you in just a minute. That's wonderful. Thank you. So, Jennifer, turning over to you. Full warning, this question's a little long, so if you could all hang with me, we'll get through it together. But so the CIF in its transformational change study that was conducted by, I don't know if you say ITAD or ITAD, but anyway, you know what I mean, in 2019, showed that its gender work impacted households and at the community level, but that longer-term systemic change was occurring only selectively. rather than across the board as a more regular outcome of program efforts that could support inclusive institutions, including informal institutions such as norms and behavior change. In your long-standing work on gender for the World Bank Group, what are some of the most common gender gaps that you encounter, and particularly in relation to climate, but also other environment and natural resource-based sectors? And then finally, what are some of the effective gender design mechanisms for addressing these?
Thanks, and thanks everybody. It's an honor to be here. So when you say gender gaps, I'd like to frame them in the sort of what's become the World Bank's definition for gender gaps in its own work, and it's sort of based on the World Development Report 2012, Gender and Development, and also on the World Bank Group Gender Strategy 2016 to 23, where gender gaps can be divided into basically 3 pillars. There are gender gaps, and I'd like to echo what Gertrude said about this being about a power imbalance rather than just about women or girls. First, there are human endowments such as education and health. The second pillar is more and better jobs. That refers to gender gaps in things like female labor force participation, occupational segregation, types of employment, informal and formal employment, and also the lion's share of work and household care burdens that fall on women due to gender norms that are pretty rigid in certain parts of the world that the bank works in. Then the third pillar is asset ownership and control. Women tend to have lower rates of ownership of household assets like land and other assets, also financial assets. And then finally, the fourth pillar is voice and agency. And so that can range from political participation, decision-making in government, or that could be local users groups, and in the climate space, that could be water users groups and communities. And also gender-based violence falls under that pillar. So I would say that in my work related to gender and climate change, the 2 most common gaps that come up actually are the 2 economic empowerment gender gaps, more and better jobs, and land and asset ownership and control. So for example, as Gertrude was mentioning, women tend to own land at much lower rates than men do. And my bias is, I need to state, is a little bit more in the South Asia region, so I'm speaking to that context when I'm talking about gender inequalities and asset ownership. But in South Asian countries, a really common channel through which land is acquired and owned is through inheritance. And as Gertrude was mentioning, there may be gender equal laws or constitutional provisions for equal ownership, but often customs, long-standing customs. And these aren't necessarily religion-based, but those can be very rigid in terms of keeping the land and other household assets being given in inheritance to sons and not daughters. And so on that point, actually, one of the things we found in Bangladesh, for example, which has low rates of women's land ownership and better, but still compared to men, low rates of access to land and rights over decision-making, which of course can pertain to agricultural production and access to irrigation systems, et cetera. We found, using a data set, Bangladesh Integrated Household Survey, which is rurally representative, that families, the majority of households in Bangladesh being Muslim, that adhered more strictly to Muslim personal law were more likely to have daughters inheriting anything than households that just went by the age-old customs of giving the shares of everything to sons. So one of a recommendation or a useful lever can actually be to leverage religious laws that may be more codified and used in people's lives in making sure that women have access to inheritance and ownership, because if they sort of devolve to just the customs, they might not have that access. Also, in terms of labor force participation and just involvement in climate-relevant sectors, the environment and natural resources sector at the bank has a lot of projects that are attempting to close a lot of these gender gaps in economic empowerment. And I have an example that I'd like to talk about from Bangladesh, but I'm mindful of the time, so I
No,
can
you're
also
fine
talk
on
about
time.
that
Go,
later.
if you can
Okay.
do it in a minute or two, you're on.
Sure, sure. So the Bangladesh Sustainable Coast and Marine Fisheries Project just went to board and was approved in December. And it's a very important project for Bangladesh because of the physical and cultural characteristics and the livelihoods of 100 or 165 million people in the country are defined by the delta area, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna Delta, which is the world's largest and most densely populated delta, and also one of the richest in aquatic economies. But I went on mission, when we went into the villages, some of these fishing villages near the Sundarbans, we found that it was only men who were participating in the local livelihoods. They had, bought boats or leased boats and were going out into the water and fishing. And women, with the exception of widows, weren't working at all. So this, and also there's a problem for the male fishermen because due to climate change, the fish yields were becoming lower and lower. So this project paid attention not only to finding alternative livelihoods for the male fishermen, so that they weren't going into debt, and actually there were some instances of suicide in the village because the male fishermen would get so indebted, but also looking at ways in which women also could participate in the fisheries sector in ways that were still culturally appropriate. And in this particular village, women were fairly restricted in their mobility and weren't weren't venturing far from the household. So there was a wonderful organization, WorldFish, that has an office in Bangladesh, and they actually had been, when I met with them, designing small nets that women could use to fish out small fish and larger fish, I guess, in the canals that ran through the villages, and this was socially acceptable. So trying to find those workaround approaches that will still remain within the cultural parameters of a particular community or society, but also allow women to become more economically empowered are some of the most effective strategies that these projects are using.
Wow. That's interesting. It reminds me of what we heard this morning in the opening plenary about, what was it, bringing a fresh brain? Whoever thought of designing these smaller nets clearly is an example of that. Thank you for sharing that. So, and then my next question for you is, in your experience at the World Bank, what are the most effective routes of encouraging action towards gender transformative outcomes? And what are the common barriers, but then conversely, what are sort of the faster on-ramps to affecting institutional transformation, especially when we really drill down and look at these second-generation outcomes, like my personal favorite, which is always voice and agency, because that's what I do for a living. That's my bias. But could you say more about those on-ramps and barriers?
Yeah, I think that one of the, it's really important to actually, in terms of women's economic empowerment, but also broader empowerment, to think about what the social norms that divide men and women and girls and boys into these different categories, or femininities are defined by a woman's role in the household and as a mother and a wife and a carer for children, and that may keep her closer to the household, and it's harder for her to work outside of the home, whereas men have a masculinity role, related role in being the breadwinner, and they are more in the public space and workplaces and certainly out in public spaces. And it's important to be able to, this is one of the greatest challenges and the longest term challenges, but to try to get under the beliefs or the incentives that keep people invested in those sorts of rigidly gender divided identities and the related behaviors and attitudes. So in South Asia, for example, conditional cash transfer programs and education projects have been extremely effective in being able to raise the perception of the girl child's value in the household. Stipends are given to households. This has been very successful in Bangladesh, for example, and also Pakistan and India. giving stipends to poor households that keep daughters in school and keep them from early marriage, for example. And in turn, they're more likely to stay in school, develop education and skills that are more marketable, and have faster routes to economic empowerment and other kinds of empowerment, decision making. So that comes in. That's very important in terms of the institutions you're talking about, whether they're formal laws or government, women having a role in those institutions to be able to have capacity to talk about gender gaps and gender differences, and then also in the more informal institutions, just being more involved in decision making in households.
Right.
So especially in settings where household incomes are based on household, I don't want to say necessarily enterprises, but something based on farming or livestock, large or small livestock rearing. It's important to be able to understand also how to move women into more the front ends of value chains where they actually are being remunerated with income, instead of being on the back ends where they're weeding or packaging the products in the household, and they're not paid, and they're not seen as bringing in their own income, and this can affect or sort of maintain their low degree of contributing to household decisions.
Great. So now I think we're going to start, as we start to wrap up, and before we take questions from the audience, this is sort of a bridge from us to all of you, very concretely, which is, gathered here today. We're really lucky that we have, certainly we have a focus on delivery because we've got GDI in this meeting with us, and we have practitioners, we have policymakers, you saw the word clouds this morning, we have, financiers and so on. I don't know if any of you were like me, but some of the work on gender keeps me up at night, literally. And sometimes I think of really interesting things. So I'm going to ask you to, considering the audience that you have here, there's so much research on climate responsive adaptation, there's resilience, there's gender response, you name it, there's a lot of research. But sometimes I think buried in that is what you all know to be true from your daily experience, what you hear from the women and men that you work with, what you hear in your project implementation, what you hear when you're out in the village. And so what is for each of you, what is one thing, a sort of a burning idea or message? Ideally, probably hopeful and practical, but it could be negative if you need to. But what is the one thing that you want the policymakers and the practitioners in this room to know about that keeps you up at night? It could be an innovation, a thought, a concern. Just one thing that you really are thinking a lot about that maybe we don't hear enough about. So Maria Elena, over to you.
Thank you, Millie. I think based on the work that we have done so far, we really see that access to information is key, and that spreading the message, raising awareness of climate shocks, climate vulnerabilities, and ways to address this, and also identifying the opportunities, because essentially it's about addressing marketing institutional failures that are reflecting existing gender inequalities. I think this is what keeps us up at night, and we really strive through our work to promote this and address those issues.
Okay, thank you. Gertrude?
Yeah, what keeps me up at night? Well, it doesn't really keep me up at night, but what I feel is the missing link is that the policymaker should understand that reform is not transform. That
Reform is not transform.
Yes. That the two are different, and that we don't want gender as an add-on. Gender considerations are very, very important. They are the missing link in our development and whatever, forest conservation and everything. But we shall not achieve gender equality if we continue to treat gender as an add-on.
Okay. Jennifer?
Yeah, given the context of rapid urbanization in the places where we work and around the globe, and the context of growing investments in climate-smart cities. One thing that keeps me up at night is thinking about the links between women's work, transport, especially public transport, and gender-based violence. And I'm always shocked when I hear, when there are studies, reliable and representative studies, how high rates are of women being sexually harassed or subject to other forms of gender-based violence in public transport. And I mean, in some South Asian countries, it ranges between 70 and 90% in some countries of women and girls experiencing this on public transport. So, I mean, I know that CIF invests through ADB in gender-responsive clean transport projects, such as rapid bus transit in East Asia, and these meet the specific transport needs of women in terms of service delivery and vehicle and station design, so that people are becoming more aware of what gender-based violence and sexual harassment is. They're learning about how to recognize it and stand up to it. And then also the facilities and the services themselves are being constructed in ways, especially using solar energy as much as possible, in climate-smart ways that are affordable and that also can give people access to ways to report incidents of sexual assault or harassment on buses. And there are some great projects, one in Mexico that I can think of that use this Hazme al Paro approach, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, literally, or the colloquial means have my back, but it's a multi-sectoral approach to trying to mitigate risk of gender-based violence in the public transport system in Mexico, training police, educating citizens about standing up and saying something when they see something, and then also having kiosks in stations that give women or any survivor of sexual assault, give information on how and where to report it and where they can go for treatment services.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you for that. So I think I don't want to take up too much time summarizing this very rich dialogue, because I want to leave time for the audience, because I'm hoping and sensing that there will be some great questions. But, you know, we've heard so much about just the myriad complexity of how interwoven work on gender is. And I think, you know, I was particularly struck, Gertrude, by your comment that you just simply cannot treat gender as an add-on. And I do think that is a risk that we all run. And you all spoke in very different ways about, you know, how, yes, it's true that there are patriarchal systems, and there's no continent that I've been on where that wasn't the case. However, you all spoke, I think, very eloquently about how you can shift that. And I was particularly struck also, I mean, this sort of, it's nice to have a tangible image, this idea of taking a net and changing it so that, you know, women can, in fact, and in my work in West Africa, we've certainly seen that with farm implements and things that you can do and changes that can be made. So to me, I was left with a very hopeful message that we're not just going to throw up our hands and say that there's nothing that can be done, and that gender transformation and transformative approaches really can happen. The thing I heard a lot of embedded in all of your remarks was just how much listening had to happen for these programs to change and for these ideas to emerge, and how closely you must have worked with local men and women specifically to make that happen. So with that, before I turn it over to questions, you know, I just wanted to wrap up by saying that, you know, these ideas are just really the start of a wide-ranging dialogue that CIF will be having on the most compelling and effective ways to work on gender transformative investments, notably under the upcoming third phase of its Gender Action Plan, which is something I'm very excited about, and that this is now under a development for implementation from now until 2021 and onwards. So with that, I hope we have microphones in the audience, and I'd like to see some hands. If we could have a question, if you could go first, please, and then we'll take them one by one. So I'll ask you to raise your hands again in a minute. Here we go. Here comes a microphone. And please say your name and your institution. Thanks.
Hi, I think it's on. Okay, yes. My name is Katie Pogue. I'm with the Clean Cooking Alliance. We're an initiative of the United Nations Foundation just next door. I want to pick up on this comment about gender as an add-on because I think that really keeps me up at night. And we've talked about this a little bit on this panel, but if you guys could speak to this concretely about, I worry that those of us who are implementing projects or donors, this concept now of, okay, you can have a climate project, you can have a health project, you can have an energy access project, but it better be gender responsive. It better be, gender integrated, and all of these kind of buzzwords we're using around gender. Is that, and these now, I feel it turns into a ticking the box exercise for these programs. And so do you feel, from your expert opinions, that this is actually doing us a disservice, or is it because it's being implemented so poorly that it's doing us a disservice? And just say a little bit more about that.
So I would ask, in the interest of time, that not all three of you respond. Is there one, maybe two of you that would like to respond to that?
I can respond.
Jennifer and Gertrude? Go ahead, Jennifer, and then we'll take it with Gertrude.
Okay, so I'm putting on my gender group hat now, and there's a gender tag system in the bank that is ultimately managed by the gender group. But there's a requirement now that between 50 and 55% of projects, depending if they're IBRD or IDA, get a gender tag. And this is a way of having projects pay really close attention and deep, meaningful attention to gender, trying to look for transformational outcomes, but not in ways that are just, gender informed, gender sensitive. And actually, if a project document uses those types of phrases, it can get docked. It sort of stands out as, we need to look for deeper signs. Maybe there's just this sort of shallow treatment of gender issues. And to get the tag, a project needs to have identified at least one gender gap through analysis, usually with statistics or something, have an action in the components of the project that directly responds to that gap and attempts to close it, and then finally a meaningful indicator that measures how well the project has done in closing that gap. And that way, it's not just, and the gap has to be relevant to the project development objective and goals. So that's a way of keeping the attention to gender deep, relevant to the project, as well as these 4 pillars that I mentioned in the gender strategy, and also really affecting ultimately some kind of transformational change.
Okay. Gertrude, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up you brought up that one, because gender indeed has become a buzzword, just like sustainability. And what we need to do is what I've said, that transformation rather than reform. When it's transformation, it's a total package. Institutional rules change. Not just if they give you funding, if a donor gives you funding, they should follow through. When it comes to, to follow through, when it comes to evaluation, to monitoring, it should be human rights based, and it should be qualitative as well as quantitative. How it delivers the gender equality value to the intended recipients should be assessed, and the information used actually to make decisions in a next project. But if there is no follow-up, and if they depend on you to bring your information to them, I sit on a desk and write whatever it is I want to write. So it is a total package. It's deliberate.
Okay. All right, and I know, just 1 second. So you were waiting. The gentleman, actually, yes, please. Just behind. Yes, right here. The gentleman, right? Yeah, he had the mic. Sorry. I'm trying. She's next. Oh, well, fine. You have the microphone, please. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I will apologize before for my poor English, but I will try my best. Thank you so much for all the information that you give us. I have one question for all of you. you talk about the information, comment on dit, défi?
Challenge.
Challenge.
For us from rural community, this is very, very strong one. So you see all things now are in the new technology process, website, Twitters, and so on. So. But you mentioned our reality. You mentioned many good things, strategies, and so solutions. But our difficulties is the connection with us from all those plan of action, proposals, solutions, strategies. I think there is gap. There is comment on dit, fossé.
Gap.
Is gap between you guys at this level and rural communities, especially we talk about women.
Okay.
For my sister, Gertrude, I see she talk about indigenous in the, it's not only indigenous, but she raised that somehow. And we have our own experience sometime. One of our experience was we was in a big selection meeting. There was the biggest number was global communities, especially in Africa. And they said, okay, we will select man and woman. And the women from dominant communities did not have all the, comment on dit, les matériels qu'il faut, les critères qu'il faut. They don't have a criteria to be selected. Yeah. But there was indigenous women who had criteria. But they jumped like there was not woman. And they just select man from global society. Just to tell you that Gertrude, I know you know, we face this kind of frustration, this kind of marginalization in Africa, in many situations. So what do you think? How you, a big organization of African civil society and CIF program, state, what can you do to change really this situation in a way that is important, comment, suffisant?
Sufficient.
Well, sufficient. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Gertrude, do you want to take the...
Yeah, I understand your question, my sister Saudata, and I appreciate your frustration because we've been in pretty much the same situation. That's what I alluded to when I talked about patriarchal system. The norms, the values, the beliefs need to be changed. But you know that we are going to face stiff resistance, but we must persist. And that's what we're talking about, capacity building for the women, to be able to seek grievance redress systems, to be able to, so we appeal to our international organizations, trying to those people of like mind at international level, to those people who are donors or development partners or private sector. Whenever, the most important thing is actually breaking that barrier at the practitioner level. The most important thing is attacking patriarchy at its source. And not really, I've used the word attacking, but when we use attack, it will put up a defense. So we should be able to go out there and educate people. Go out there and involve men and women. The mistake that we've done is that we have sought to build the capacity of only women. But even men need their capacities built to show them that no one is taking away anything from them, that two heads are better than one.
That's well said. Did you want to add anything, Marilena, or you're just agreeing?
I fully agree. And I can also add, in terms of access to information and especially reaching rural areas, this was a challenge for ClimaDapt as well. So having a very strong project implementation unit and working to organize events and inviting both men and women, soil management day, technology workshops, spreading the message and really making sure that both men and women have access to this type of information was critical for the success of project implementation.
Okay, so I think we have time for about one more question. I know, sir, you've been waiting, and then we'll see if we can do any more. And then over here. Go ahead, please, quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and thank you for the opportunity. Maybe she's also waiting in the queue. Maybe you
Yes,
should give
she'll-
her
yes.
opportunity. The question that I have, we have a selfish reason for asking this. Actually, when you say gender first of all, I want to sincerely thank for your excellent insights. When we say gender transformative or transformational investments, up to now, I mean, generally, the social benefits of gender mainstreaming have been very well written in the literature. But what we are looking for to get an economic basis. So for that, actually, UN Women and ADB are organizing a workshop next month in July to look at the economic basis for gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming also has economic implications in terms of additional costs. A project without gender mainstreaming and a project with gender mainstreaming, what are additional costs and what are the additional benefits? Social benefits, we are all familiar, but economic benefits, if we are talking about investments, everybody is looking for rate of return. So I want to know panel's views of any studies that have really evaluated the economic rate of return from fully mainstreamed or gender mainstreamed investments. Thank you.
Yeah. Who wants to go first?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I can't quote exactly because I don't have it just like here. But I know that Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has conducted a study and come to the conclusion that if the same resources are given that are given to men are given to women, there's going to be increased productivity in food, and it will go towards reduction of hunger significantly. And this has been proven through a research that was conducted. So later on, maybe if we get together, I could search for this research and share it with you. But you see, gender responsiveness has intrinsic value, and it's been proven. There are lots of studies that I could share with you. I wasn't prepared for your question, but it's proven. So later on, when you spot me around the building, we could just, then I'll share with you the studies that I know would give you a good answer. I know that it would be costly. It adds some costs when you're going to, for instance, conduct a gender analysis. But the rate, you are talking about returns. Yeah, the returns are much better when you've conducted a gender analysis than when you haven't. Yeah. When you implement a project and then it falls to the ground because the gender analysis wasn't conducted. Yeah.
Yeah. Marilena, and by the way, anyone in the room, I'm sure we all have our favorite studies that answer his questions, so I encourage you to all find him at the break and give him your favorites, and you owe me for that. Marilena, please, and then Jennifer, if you have anything to add before we take our last question.
This is a very timely question, and it touches upon the evaluation and learning activity that we conducted in Tajikistan. So we wanted to see how women and men sub-borrowers found the investments to work and what were the benefits. And indeed, women reported increased health and well-being outcomes as a result of purchasing and implementing those technologies, as well as increased access to information and overall improved household decision-making, especially in terms of allocating funds for purchase of other assets. So we have this information available. It was great learning for us, and it was also great learning for partner financial institutions, because once they understand and they realize what they can offer to their clients, both men and women, they can also tailor their products, their marketing strategies, and it's a win-win.
Great. Jennifer, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, just briefly. This is a really interesting question for many reasons, but one of which is, in it, I still hear a little bit of a conceptualization of doing gender as an add-on. You know, how much more will it cost? And I think, and this is what the gender tag in the World Bank Group system is trying to get at, is if a project has human beneficiaries, it's going to have gender issues. There are going to be different needs, different levels of access, different constraints that men and women and boys and girls have, whether it's access to electricity. Women-headed households are known to have be less able to afford fees. You know, whether it's access to water services or irrigation because of unequal rights to land, et cetera. So that those differences need to be acknowledged and ideally addressed through the project integrally, as an integral part of whatever the project components are, in order to better serve this broader range of people. And there are studies, I can't name them right now, but the more a project pays attention to these differential needs of men and women and boys and girls, the more effective, efficient, and sustainable that project is going to be.
Right. And I'll give you a bunch of them as well. So with that, I believe you have been waiting patiently, and you'll be our last question, so thank you.
Well, thank you. I do qualitative research, and I have interviewed hundreds of women, and I feel like sometimes there is like a misunderstanding in this idea of how to introduce gender in some projects. And sometimes, for example, I have had a woman questioning like, why are you offering me a job? Please give the job to my husband, because if you give it to me, I will have to do the job and the house and the children, and my husband doesn't have a job, and he's going to drink, and he's going to spend the money. And I mean, of course, I know that is more than that, but I would like to know, in your opinion, what are like the successful histories, like really making a project really understand what is really empowering women, considering really the realities and the situations that women have to deal with. And just one observation, what I've seen in my work is that sometimes it's, for example, for women that are in their own, that they don't have a husband, because sometimes because they are their husband are immigrants in another country or whatever, then it's easier for us to empower them, because they are in their own and they find many ways to take advantage of all of the opportunities. But when they are part of a family, or they have a husband, or then it's not that easy. Then I would like to know, what do you think about it?
So, who would like to begin answering that?
Yeah. Okay, if I could start.
Sure.
Yeah, I see two things in your question. Number one, the women that you are dealing, I work at the grassroots myself, and I've encountered women like you have encountered. Women have been indoctrinated. You know, they feel inadequate. I mean, if someone repeats something to you many times, enough times, you will begin to believe it. If someone tells you you're ugly, you're ugly, you're ugly, you will begin to think that you're really ugly when you are not. So they've been indoctrinated. A development project should be able to address that one. Build the capacity of a woman. Bring her out of that abyss of looking at herself as not able. And the most important thing is participation. Many of these projects are top-down. If they were bottom-up, And the women participated at the inception of the project in selecting a project. Then they would be able to select a project that's appropriate for them. Not someone coming and saying, I'm going now to give you a cow. And the woman looks at the cow and says, now I've got to stall feed it and I've got to source food and that sort of thing. They would find something that fits within her schedule that can be of benefit to her. For instance, if she doesn't own land, she might choose to do an apiary, yeah, that doesn't require fertile land. And she knows that the husband has a patch of land he's not using, and he will say, okay, you can put here. I'm just giving that as an example. So the participation of women in decision making, the participation of women in not just contributing information, but effective, meaningful participation to provide information that will be used in decision making to select a project. For me, that's what I see as
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else or no? All right. So the job for all of you, I know there's a little bit more before there's a reception, but you've been a wonderful audience. But before you leave, anyone who didn't come to this panel, your job is to ask them why not and tell them what they missed. So with that, I would love for you to join me in thanking our excellent panelists, Mary Elena, Gertrude, and Jennifer. All right. So what happens next? Okay.
Thank
we
you
could go
to our
on.
panelists. I'm going to keep this short and sweet. I know we're short on time, so thank you so much for that important discussion on the critical need for gender transformation in climate action. And honestly, I could not agree more that gender should not be an add-on. And as Gertrude said, we must not be afraid to keep up the pressure for gender equality and gender mainstreaming in development and decision-making across the board. So if I can just wrap up quickly, some top-line highlights from the whole day. At the high-level panel this morning on tackling delivery challenges for climate action, I think one great takeaway was Anselm Schneider's memorable but tragic story about the breathing machine that was fixed at the cost of a human life. I think that really helps to remind us that in the end, whether it's health or climate or education or any of the sectors involved in the Sustainable Development Goals, that human beings, human capital, and human development really need to be at the core of everything we do. At the breakout sessions, we had the 6 delivery case studies on clean energy, resilience building, sustainable forest management, and energy access that really just served as a point of departure for very interesting discussions. Some common themes that came up across the sessions were the need for flexibility, the making of new and unusual connections, and the importance of involving youth, women, and local communities in both the planning and the implementation of the project so that they are truly community-driven and local capacity can be built. So thank you for joining us here today and engaging with the panels and the colleagues and really helping to put the Learning Lab mission of the CIFS and the evidence-based expertise of GDI into practice. I think we really need to commit to listening, learning, and sharing with one another across silos and sectors so that we can, as Mafalda said, disrupt preconceived notions and reconcile the unreconcilable and create the transformational climate action that the world urgently needs. So it's been a long, full day, but I do hope that you all would choose that big, smiling, happy face emoji if I were to ask you that emoji survey question now. I think you'll be even happier to know that the reception is happening now, just across the way in the lounge. I think we've got some fun pictures to look at too. Thank you. And thank you again for being here today. I'll see you tomorrow for another day of learning and sharing at 9:30 in the morning. So thank you all, and thank you to our online audience for your engagement.